Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds. These two people seem to be constantly referenced in this situation. In this account, Ryan Reynolds is said to be a major player in a lot of what happened, particularly the story that's being built around Justin Baldoni and others who've been associated with this case. Problem, though, is that when it came time for him to be present in a courtroom, he wasn't there. There's a lot of speculation that can be made on this situation. Some people think that this may be a public relations blunder on his part, while others think that there may be more to it, especially considering that his involvement, particularly with some texts that have come to light and that have been made a part of the legal record, may have muddled things for Blake's own claims. Texts that have come to light seem to indicate that he was being very active in the media, fighting back and engaging in a bit of a fight. Question that people continue to pose on this situation, though, is this: if both parties are fighting back, who really is retaliating against who? No one seems certain why he didn't attend. Some describe him as unpredictable, others think he may be trying to protect his career. But from a public perspective, the optics weren't great. At the same time, Blake was also making headlines. A report claimed she asked her driver to go home and bring her expensive mahjong tiles so she could pass time playing solitaire during the conference. Whether that story is accurate isn't fully clear, but it added to the conversation. Some observers felt it made the situation seem less serious than expected. Typically, during court breaks, people spend time speaking with their legal teams, reviewing what just happened and preparing for what comes next, not playing games. This led to speculation that she may not have expected a settlement, or that she wasn't treating the moment with urgency. Meanwhile, attention turned to what had been happening behind the scenes in August, particularly around the media coverage. One name kept surfacing: Leslie Sloan. Many believe she played a major role in shaping what information reached the press. When a Daily Mail article was published on August 9th, one describing troubling events on set, Sony's reaction was immediate and intense. CEO Tom Rothman reportedly felt the leak could damage the film. But a big question followed. How did Sony know the leak came from Blake's side? Blake's position suggested otherwise, pointing toward Melissa Nathan and claiming the story was meant to make her team look responsible. However, if we look at the timeline as of August 8th, there are more details to consider. In the morning, James Vuka, a journalist, reached out to Leslie. She was not available to talk as she was on a plane. Nevertheless, they continued to communicate. She disputed the information provided to him, stating that there was no truth to the reports about conflicts on set, power struggles, or tension between Blake and Justin. James Vuka had received information that Blake and Ryan had wanted to make changes to certain parts of the movie. They had strong views about the direction of the movie, which was not true. Later on, she was able to talk. At the same time, she was in communication with others. Sarah Nathan reached out to her, asking to talk. She quickly responded, stating that Justin's team had already reached out to the Daily Mail to blame Blake. She urged Sarah to put out a counterstory. She also indicated what the counterstory should entail. It was to include the fact that the cast was not talking to Justin. Also, that there was a premiere arrangement that had separated Justin from the others. Lastly, that Blake had given Sarah hesitated, trying to delay publication. Leslie then said she had convinced the Daily Mail to hold their peace. Yet simultaneously, she was also messaging Danny at Sony, claiming another figure, Stephanie Jones, was spreading negative stories about Blake. She repeated to him the same rumors circulating, that Blake and Ryan had insisted on rewrites and had clashed creatively with Justin. During this period, Leslie was juggling multiple conversations at once, with journalists, studio contacts, and media outlets. She asked Sony to intervene with Stephanie in a careful, non-confrontational way, warning that rumors could hurt the film. At the same time, she was feeding details to reporters. New allegations also surfaced in these exchanges. Sarah relayed claims about uncomfortable moments during filming, and Leslie passed that information along to Sony shortly afterward. She also mentioned that crisis management support might be coming in and that more outreach was expected. Throughout all of this, Leslie appeared to be pushing for media restraint publicly, telling people to hold, while privately encouraging certain stories to move forward. Messages suggest she was coordinating narratives across multiple outlets, trying to shift negative attention away from Blake and toward Justin. By later that day, the Daily Mail and New York Post had both become central to the media strategy. The following day, the Daily Mail published a version of events that looked very different from earlier reports. framing the situation in a way that cast Blake more favorably and Justin more critically. Around the same time, another message was revealed, supposedly sent by Ryan. In this message, he was discussing the idea of using the studio if needed, while at the same time encouraging people to keep quiet and watch as things unfolded. There was discussion about the power of public opinion, the impact that the film would have, and the potential for success to quiet opposition. It was a message that was encouraging people to do two opposing things at the same time. However, at this point, Leslie had already been working behind the scenes. Later in the day, there was an email sent within Sony, supposedly to Tom Rothman and others within the company, sent by Louise. This was as the situation continued to escalate. The disturbing truth behind why Blake Lively and Her It Ends With Us co-stars are feuding with Justin Baldoni was revealed late that night. At approximately 10:06 p.m. earlier, Ryan had suggested it might be time to unleash Leslie, and throughout the day she had been in contact with reporters, Page 6, the Daily Mail and Sony, shaping what information was circulating and trying to manage how the story would land. When the article finally appeared, it claimed rumors of tension between Justin and Blake had been building for weeks. An unnamed source described Justin as unprofessional and chauvinistic on set, saying he focused too heavily on the male perspective while filming scenes about abuse. Peace suggested he clashed with Blake over her input, created a tense working environment, and struggled to include women's perspectives in the process. It also said he took script changes personally and felt ganged up on. Tone of the article was serious and dramatic, but behind the scenes, reactions inside Sony were immediate and uneasy. The story was quickly shared with studio leadership. One executive worried it wouldn't accomplish what it seemed intended to do, noting that the single-source framing made Leslie sound defensive and could reinforce the narrative that Blake was being controlling. Another senior executive described the situation bluntly as a disaster, saying the controversy itself had now become the story, and that once something like this is public, it's almost impossible to undo. The concern wasn't just about who was right or wrong, it was that the film itself might now be viewed through the lens of this conflict. Even if audiences tried to focus on the movie, the surrounding drama could shape how people experienced it. Internally, the discussion also reflected a different interpretation of the situation. Some believed the issue wasn't really about abuse or misconduct, but more about creative disagreements, differing views on tone, storytelling, and how the subject matter should be handled. Others worried the conversation was spiraling into something more damaging, especially with emotionally charged language being used publicly. There was also frustration that the media strategy appeared to be backfiring. Stories placed to support Blake weren't landing the way expected. Instead of strengthening her position, they sometimes fueled criticism and reinforced the idea that the situation was messy and poorly managed. A few days later, another internal message suggested that continuing this approach might only deepen the perception that Blake was difficult to work with. The view inside the studio was that the entire situation had been handled in a way that felt chaotic and risky, and that it was now creating more problems than it solved. To better understand what was really happening, the studio began closely monitoring social media and public reactions. The data painted a complicated picture. Controversy generated over 216,000 mentions, roughly a third of all online conversation about the film. Surprisingly, it didn't seem to reduce interest in seeing the movie. But sentiment was mixed. A large share of online reactions leaned supportive of Justin, especially among younger audiences on platforms like TikTok and Twitter. Facebook and Instagram, on the other hand, showed more balanced or supportive reactions toward Blake. Many people focused on the tension itself, separate red carpets, cast dynamics, and the sense that there were two sides to the story. Some viewers felt Justin treated the subject of domestic violence with seriousness in interviews. Others criticized Blake for appearing to soften that aspect, focusing more on fashion, appearances, and promotional projects. Conversation wasn't one-sided, it was layered, emotional, and often contradictory. Press coverage reflected a similar split, much of it neutral, with smaller portions leaning toward one side or the other. Internationally, the topic received far less attention overall. From the studio's perspective, this feedback was valuable. It showed that the backlash wasn't entirely driven by manipulation. Much of it seemed organic, coming from real audience reactions. And it highlighted something important. People were responding strongly to how the film's themes were being discussed publicly. Takeaway for the team was clear. the goal was to shift public perception, the messaging needed to refocus on the film's central issues, especially the serious subject matter that resonated with viewers. Talking more openly about those themes in interviews, on red carpets, and across social media could help rebalance the narrative and reconnect audiences with the heart of the story. In other words, the path forward wasn't more spin. It was clarity, consistency, and speaking directly to what mattered most to the audience. The feedback Blake received was clear. If she spoke more directly about the film's domestic violence themes, it could help balance public perception. And almost immediately, her actions suggested she was responding to that advice. Around the same time Sony shared that feedback, Blake texted Brandon Sklenar. She told him they were looking into resources for people experiencing domestic violence and suggested he could share them too. Brandon replied positively, saying he'd been getting intense comments and that the situation was frustrating. Blake added that Sony was preparing a graphic listing support organizations by region and would send it soon. Brandon agreed that it was a good idea and suggested holding off on unrelated promotional content for the moment, given how conversations online were leaning. He also expressed strong anger toward Justin, describing him in harsh terms and accusing him of projecting a false image. From this perspective, Blake didn't interpret the criticism as a signal that the marketing approach needed to change. Instead, she seemed to view Justin's interviews, where he focused on domestic violence, as a calculated move meant to make her side look bad. In her view, his messaging wasn't simply about the film's themes, it was retaliation. But this reaction also highlighted a bigger tension. Younger audiences, especially those familiar with the book's fandom, were already deeply invested in the story and its message. Many of them felt confused and unsettled when they saw the cast divided and Justin seemingly pushed aside without explanation. From their point of view, something clearly had changed, and no one was fully addressing it. At the same time, another group was watching closely. Readers who had connected with the story because of personal experiences with domestic violence. For them, the subject wasn't abstract. It was deeply personal. And when the film's marketing seemed to shift tone, focusing more on glamour, branding, and promotion, some felt the seriousness of the topic was being softened. This reaction wasn't happening in isolation. Fans were remembering earlier controversies tied to the book's promotion. One example was the announcement of an adult coloring book based on the story. The idea received heavy backlash, with many saying it felt inappropriate given the themes. The project was eventually cancelled after criticism. Then, months before the film's release, another promotional effort drew attention. A nail polish collaboration inspired by the book. Once again, some fans questioned whether commercial products tied to a story about domestic violence were appropriate. Comments online reflected frustration, confusion, and concern about whether the message was being diluted. These reactions created a pattern in the eyes of some observers, a belief that the story's emotional core was being packaged in ways that felt more commercial than reflective. And as the film approached release, that perception fed into the wider conversation already unfolding around the cast, the marketing, and the narrative itself. Inside the studio, there was growing concern that the public discussion had shifted too far away from the film's intended message. Instead of focusing on domestic violence and the story's emotional weight, media coverage and online debate were increasingly centered on personal conflicts, accusations, and behind-the-scenes drama. Over time, the narrative kept evolving, from creative disagreements to allegations, then to debates over intent, marketing, and public image. For some, it became difficult to separate the film from the controversies surrounding it. Studio leadership had warned early on that once the conflict became the headline, it would shape how audiences experienced the movie. And more than a year later, that prediction seemed to hold true. Conversations weren't centered on the themes or impact of the story, they were centered on the fallout. Meanwhile, internal frustrations grew. Some executives felt the film hadn't been protected the way Hollywood typically handles sensitive situations, by keeping disagreements private and presenting a unified front. Instead, visible divisions, unfollows on social media, and separate promotional paths made the conflict impossible to ignore. There were also concerns about what might happen if the situation moved into a courtroom. Studio leaders, executives, and financial records could all become part of the public discussion. Budgets, marketing costs, and internal communications might be examined in detail, potentially reshaping how the entire project was understood. At the center of it all, Ryan's involvement was increasingly viewed as complicated. His public support, media responses, and behind-the-scenes influence raised questions about how much his actions affected the broader narrative. Some speculated that his visibility and the role he played could make him a key figure if the situation escalated legally. And so the debate continues. Who shaped the public narrative and how did it spiral so far from the film's original message? Those are the questions people keep asking and the ones still driving discussion today.